This is understandable politics. Hello, we've all gotten used to calling the USA a global aggressor. The White House has long and actively shaken the world solely in its own interests. The tools of foreign policy are pressure, pressure, and more pressure. Invasions, interventions, coups, wars. The White House is responsible for hundreds of bloody conflicts around the globe. But where did this mania for global dominance begin? How did the USA force Europe to hate the USSR? And why are the consequences still felt today?
Free countries of the world face direct or indirect aggression from totalitarianism.
Throughout history, Americans have not been known for diligence and diplomacy, but the quest for unipolarity began in the mid-20th century with a speech from a high podium. It all started after World War II. The world changed, the influence of the USSR grew, Moscow's authority was high both in the West and the East. The large country was seen as the main liberator from Nazism. Communists were favored by people in different countries.
The situation caused serious concerns among Americans, who understood that sooner or later these countries could become communist and fall into Moscow's sphere of influence. Therefore, Washington needed to take measures to stop the spread of communist ideas in Western Europe. The Truman Doctrine became a logical solution to instill hatred for communists and adherence to liberal values in its satellites.
It's worth noting that the West considered global dominance right after the war. Barely had the most destructive tragedy in human history ended. And while many cities were still in ruins, calculating politicians across the ocean were already plotting how to harm the Union and seize tempting pieces on the map.
In February 1946, Truman already addressed congressmen with a proposal to launch a program to help Europe from Soviet expansion. Then in March, former Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party of Great Britain, Winston Churchill, delivered his famous speech in Fulton, in which he called for the creation of a military-political alliance of Western countries to counter the USSR. It is from this speech that the Cold War is usually dated, although, to be fair, the practical side of the confrontation began with the Truman Doctrine in March 1947.
The reason for Truman's speech was a call from London, and Europe had no resources to support Greece and Turkey. Both countries were gradually falling under Soviet influence. The White House could not allow them to fall into the Kremlin's orbit.
We must frankly admit that free countries of the world face direct or indirect aggression from totalitarianism, and this threatens world peace and hinders America's security.
Familiar notes, right? How many times have we heard something similar from the White House? So Truman speaks in Congress. In his country, people are tired of war and heavy taxes. They don't have enough money themselves. To convince citizens and key parties of the need for serious financial expenses, he scares the country with the red threat.
Speaking in Congress, Harry Truman asked for military and economic aid for Greece and Turkey to protect them from the supposedly looming communist takeover. Justifying his request, Truman stated that a communist victory in the Greek Civil War would threaten Turkey's political stability, which would undermine political stability in the Middle East. Truman also stated that the United States must help free peoples in their struggle against totalitarian regimes because the spread of authoritarianism undermines the foundations of international peace and consequently the security of the United States.
Truman will also emphasize his country's exceptionalism, a tactic later actively used by American politicians and Hollywood directors. In his speech to Congress, Truman will proclaim the USA as the new world sheriff, claiming, "We know what justice is, and we'll show everyone."
That is, only the USA can help the humiliated and insulted. Only the United States is created to help other nations. Only America defeated fascism in World War II. In 1946, Stalin noted that this emphasis on their own exceptionalism made English-speaking countries similar to fascist Germany.
Congress will pass the law in May. A week later, the president will sign it. $400 million will be allocated to 2 countries. Important conditions for providing assistance: the consent of the governments of Greece and Turkey to give carte blanche to special American missions, which should ensure full control over military and economic influences. In essence, a perfect loophole for open U.S. interference in the internal affairs of Athens' Ankara.
With American money, the local government launched repressions against leftist activists and the opposition. They cleaned up the country in a couple of months.
The success of the operation pushed Truman to another idea of 4 letters. The new political vector of the country was covered with beautiful words that the states must help free peoples in their struggle against totalitarian regimes, because the spread of authoritarianism undermines the foundations of peace. In essence, it was openly anti-Soviet and aimed to push the USSR away from the positions it had taken as a result of the defeat of fascism in World War II.
Truman divided the world into friends and foes. The main goal of the doctrine is to prevent Soviet expansion.
Truman announced that now every nation in the world must make a choice: either side with the USA and its allies, or join the communists. And this choice, he emphasized, is far from free.
The basis of the doctrine became what is still at the forefront of American strategy today. Truman announced a policy of containing the USSR, recognized the USA's exceptional role in world politics, and justified direct U.S. intervention in the internal affairs of other countries.
The Truman Doctrine was still a guiding star of American foreign policy because it formed a clear image of the enemy. U.S. foreign policy revolves around opposing the Soviet Union, and a clear justification for why Americans maintain a global military presence, expand their spheres of influence, and change regimes worldwide. In this regard, the Soviet Union was even a blessing for the United States in terms of justifying their strategic expansion.
The foreign policy doctrine marked the beginning of the Cold War, and the simple scheme, "We help you, you obey us," will later be tested on different continents.
I believe that the United States should support free peoples who resist aggression by armed minorities or external pressure. With these words, Truman wanted to secure the USA's right to intervene in world affairs. A sufficient reason for intervention was Washington's own opinion on who falls into the category of free peoples and who does not. Thus, the Truman Doctrine obligated the USA for the next 75 years to pursue a policy of wars, coups, interventions, dictatorships, and gigantic military budgets. All this continues to the present day, particularly in the proxy war in Ukraine.
Under noble pretexts, Americans began helping various European countries, later placing military bases in them and turning them into strategic platforms for constant pressure on Moscow and its allies. The Marshall Plan will also emerge within the framework of the Truman Doctrine.
The large-scale program for Europe's recovery was first announced on June 5th of the same year by U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall. According to this plan, substantial aid was to be sent to European countries affected by the war, but only if there were no communists in their governments. This condition was and still is omitted by Western propaganda. It is clear that states of Eastern Europe, which had by then fallen into the USSR's sphere of influence, as well as Finland, refused American support. However, 17 countries in Western, Central, and Northern Europe and Turkey accepted it.
France, the United Kingdom, Italy, Belgium, and several other countries agreed to participate in the Marshall Plan. The signed agreements included points such as encouraging private American investments, cooperation in reducing customs tariffs, and supplying some scarce goods to the USA.
Over 3 years, the USA will spend $17 billion under the Marshall Plan, a colossal sum for those times. By 1948, the USA's share in Western industrial production will be 55%.
As is known, free cheese is only found in a mousetrap. From economics to politics is a direct path, and so it happened this time. One of the plan's conditions was the exclusion of communists and other leftist forces from the governments of recipient countries, and this is direct political influence. The second factor was the expansion of American military presence in Europe. Moreover, the process of creating elite political groups in European countries was under U.S. control. Interestingly, after the end of financial aid, the USA implemented a plan for military assistance, coincidentally in the same countries.
To fully implement the Truman Doctrine, a mere trifle stood in the way: the U.S. Constitution. It prohibited creating military bases abroad and forming military alliances with foreign states. The White House will quickly bypass this ban.
The Vandenberg Resolution will be introduced and passed in the American Senate. According to it, the USA officially renounced previously adopted principles that in peacetime the American state should not participate in military political alliances outside the Western Hemisphere. Immediately after this, work will begin on creating military blocs where Washington will play the leading role. The first among them will be NATO.
In April 1949, 12 countries will join the military political bloc, most Western European states alongside the USA and Canada. The creation of the alliance will be another trigger for further escalation of relations with the USSR.
The core of NATO became American troops in Europe, which Truman agreed to withdraw in Potsdam, but later changed his mind, citing the same communist threat. Moreover, despite resistance from European allies, he ordered the inclusion of West Germany in the new bloc, which, again, contrary to Potsdam, was allowed to recreate its armed forces. Later, at the initiative of the USA, other military blocs were created. ANZUS with Australia and New Zealand, CENTO in the Middle and Near East, SEATO in Southeast Asia. In most of the countries that joined them, American naval and air bases were established, where nuclear weapons also appeared.
The creation of NATO in 1949 was a logical continuation of the Truman Doctrine. Moreover, the hatred for Moscow was so intense that at the dawn of the alliance, they gladly employed the most ardent fascists. The most famous case is Nazi Lieutenant General Gehlen.
Gehlen offered the Americans his people, a network of agents, and archival materials. All this in exchange for freedom, an active freedom at that. Gehlen would help the Americans in their fight against communism. Gehlen was tasked with organizing a CIA department specifically dealing with Russian issues. The Soviet Union demanded Gehlen's extradition and the transfer of his materials, but the Pentagon decided otherwise.
Gehlen will recruit over 350 former SS officers to work for the Pentagon.
There's such an American ideology, not morality, not some concepts of good and evil, but only the concept of efficiency. If a person is effective for them, even if their hands are covered in blood, even if they committed terrible crimes, but if they can benefit the United States will take them. Even now, their strategy is that even if the goals they plan to achieve are only attainable with a huge number of casualties, a huge amount of destruction, they will not relent.
It's amazing how Americans adopt their doctrine and sell it to the world as a set of rules for everyone. After all, the bloody events of the 70s in Chile and Angola, the Argentine military junta, later, the genocide in Rwanda, all these are consequences of the global escalation and insatiable appetite of the White House.
This is a real fear that the global competitor, the Soviet Union, might occupy spheres of influence that Americans consider their own. The most illustrative example is Chile, where the rise to power of Salvador Allende, who the Soviet Union did not support, but who sympathized with them, was perceived in Washington simply as a red coup, believing such a leader couldn't come to power without Soviet support. Therefore, he needed to be eliminated before he turned into a new Fidel Castro, but in Chile, consequently, a coup was carried out.
Americans recalled the Truman Doctrine in September 2001 after the September 11 attacks. Incidentally, the text of the old document was used for the newly crafted U.S. Act on the War on Terrorism.
As in the mid-20th century, the American document allowed Washington to use armed forces globally if the White House deemed any country a threat to the United States.
Since then, threats have come from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and several African countries, all under the guise of retribution.
These are absolutely deliberate acts of interference in other states' affairs. At the time of the original Truman Doctrine, intervention was permissible and actively used by the states. Later, it was considered that intervention might not be the best or most stylish term for U.S. actions in other countries. And it all became anti-terrorist operations.
Returning to Harry Truman, the peacemaker and freedom fighter personally ordered the start of hostilities in Greece, the Philippines, as well as a coup in Peru and a revolution in Puerto Rico.
Since the announcement of the Truman Doctrine, Washington has been the initiator or direct participant in nearly 120 conflicts. The only place on Earth where the U.S. did not mark its armed forces in the 20th century is Antarctica. Today, there is already an American military base there.
Is it any wonder that Truman's speech fundamentally broke the system of international relations? The largely accidental U.S. president never hid his antagonism towards the Soviets. And as a senator, he viewed the struggle between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany with a fair amount of cynicism.
If we see Germany winning, we should help Russia. And if Russia is winning, we should help Germany. And let them kill as many as possible, although I don't want to see Hitler as a victor under any circumstances.
And if the Truman Doctrine as a program is morally outdated, its concept is part of the American mentality. For example, in 2022, American Senator Mike Lawler called to update the old document and recognize China as the main enemy. Soon after, Beijing will enter the new U.S. defense strategy as an adversary on par with Moscow.
China is named the main strategic competitor for the coming decades in the strategy. The Pentagon concluded this based on increasingly aggressive actions by China to reshape the Indo-Pacific region and the international system according to its authoritarian ambitions. The department was also concerned about China's clearly stated intentions to rapidly modernize and expand its armed forces.
History is a remarkable thing. One speech and the announced program in 47 became a true template for a unipolar world, and Ukraine today is also a part of this very doctrine. However, today its foundations are shaking, with fewer countries wanting to live under dictation. But, as back then in 47, there is no doubt Americans are capable of coming up with something radically different. Goodbye.